A $3 McDonald's cheeseburger contains something the food industry never intended you to notice. Not the beef, not the cheese, not the sauce, the tomato. Specifically, the seeds inside that single thin slice of tomato wedged beneath the patty. Seeds that are alive. Seeds that will germinate. Seeds that, if planted correctly, will grow into a full tomato plant capable of producing pounds and pounds of fresh fruit for months. 108 days. That is all it took to go from a fast food wrapper to a harvest that would cost you over $50 at a grocery store. Total investment, $3.14. The price of the burger? Meanwhile, the American seed industry generates over $16 billion annually selling you packets of seeds, 6 to 12 at a time, for $4 to $5 per envelope. The produce industry charges $3 to $4 per pound for tomatoes you could grow in your own backyard, and the agricultural supply chain has been engineered from the molecular level up to make sure you never think of a tomato as anything other than something you buy. They did not stop you from growing your own food because it is difficult. They stopped you because it is embarrassingly easy. A tomato seed does not care whether it came from an organic farm stand or a drive-through window. It does not care whether it was picked by hand in a heritage garden or slapped onto a quarter pounder by a teenager at 2 in the morning. A viable seed is a viable seed, and the ones sitting inside your fast food burger right now are ready to grow. The industry did not hide this from you with regulations or patents. They did something far more effective. They hid it with assumption. They built an entire culture around the idea that food is something you purchase, never something you produce. And 3 generations of Americans absorbed that assumption without ever questioning it. This is the story of a $3 cheeseburger that grew into a garden, and the billion-dollar system that made sure you would never think to try. Welcome to Forbidden Camping. If these stories matter to you, the bell and the subscribe button are the best way to preserve knowledge the industry keeps trying to bury. Here we open the vaults they locked shut. Now let me take you back. Not to ancient history this time, but to a spring afternoon and a McDonald's drive-thru. I ordered a deluxe quarter pounder with cheese because this is one of the few McDonald's burgers that actually comes with a tomato slice. After popping open the box, I lifted the bun to find the tomato. It was buried under the patty, which is where McDonald's typically places it. I pulled that single slice out and held it up, and what I saw confirmed everything. Embedded in that thin round of tomato were dozens of seeds. Pale, small, and glistening with that translucent gel casing that surrounds every tomato seed in nature. That gel casing is the reason most people fail when they try to sprout seeds from store-bought or restaurant tomatoes, and it is the reason the industry never worries about you trying. The casing contains chemical compounds that actively inhibit germination. In nature, it prevents the seed from sprouting inside the fruit while it is still on the vine. It is a biological lock, and if you do not remove it, the seed will sit in soil for weeks and do absolutely nothing. You will assume the seed was dead. You will assume fast food tomatoes are irradiated or genetically sterile. You will assume what the industry wants you to assume, that growing your own food from scraps is a fantasy. But removing that lock takes about 4 seconds. I picked 2 seeds out of the tomato slice with my fingertip, placed each one on a dry paper towel, and rubbed gently. The friction strips the gel casing right off. You can see the residue left behind on the towel, a faint smear of translucent material, and what remains is a clean, naked seed with its sprout inhibitor completely removed, ready to grow. That is the secret. 4 seconds of rubbing on a paper towel. That is the difference between a dead seed and a living plant, and nobody told you. Now, the science of why this works goes back thousands of years, but the modern understanding came together in the early 20th century. Tomato seeds require 3 conditions to germinate: moisture, warmth, and the absence of that germination inhibitor in the gel sac. The gel contains a compound called abscisic acid, a plant hormone that suppresses cell elongation and prevents the embryo inside the seed from activating. In nature, the gel breaks down through fermentation after the fruit falls and rots on the ground. The decomposition process neutralizes the abscisic acid, and only then does the seed wake up. When you rub the seed against a paper towel, you are doing mechanically in 4 seconds what nature does chemically over several weeks. You are stripping the inhibitor, you are unlocking the embryo, and you are giving that seed permission to grow. This is not theoretical. This is not a hack that works sometimes. This is plant biology. It works every time with every viable tomato seed, whether it came from a farmer's market heirloom or a fast food burger. I took my 2 clean seeds and grabbed what I had laying around. A red Solo cup. I cut slits in the bottom for drainage because waterlogged soil kills seedlings faster than neglect. Then I opened a bag of Happy Frog potting soil, dumped some on the table, and noticed it was dry right out of the bag. Dry soil repels water. Seeds planted in dry soil sit in air pockets and never make consistent contact with moisture, so I added water and mixed it by hand until the entire batch was evenly damp. Not soaking, damp. The kind of moisture where you squeeze a handful and it holds together but does not drip. That is ideal germination texture. I filled my solo cup with the damp mix, used a Sharpie to poke a shallow hole about a 1/4 inch deep, and dropped both seeds in, covered them with a pinch of soil, watered gently, done. But I wanted to push this experiment further. I wanted to know if you even need to extract the seeds at all. So I went back to McDonald's and ordered a second 1/4 pounder deluxe. This time I pulled the tomato slice out of the burger, looked at it, and instead of picking out individual seeds, I just laid the entire slice flat on the surface of a second cup of soil. Then I covered the whole thing with a thin layer of potting mix and watered it in. 1 cup with 2 extracted seeds, 1 cup with an entire tomato slice buried in dirt, both placed on a seedling heat mat under a simple LED shop light. The heat mat is the detail most people skip, and it is the detail that cuts your germination time in half. Tomato seeds germinate based on soil temperature, not air temperature. At room temperature, around 68 to 72 degrees, tomato seeds take 10 to 14 days to sprout. On a heat mat, holding soil temperature at 80 to 85 degrees, they sprout in 5 to 8 days. The mat costs about $15 and lasts for years. It is the single most underrated tool in seed starting, and the gardening industry would rather sell you pre-grown transplants at $4 each than tell you about it. 8 days later, both cups had sprouted. The 2 extracted seeds both came up, healthy and strong, 2 perfect little seedlings pushing through the soil with their cotyledon leaves spread wide. And the cup with the whole tomato slice buried inside had an even more impressive germination rate. Multiple seedlings were emerging, with more still pushing up from below. The entire slice had been a seed bomb, and every viable seed in it was waking up. That moment should stop you. A slice of tomato from a $3 fast food burger, buried in dirt in a plastic cup, produced more viable seedlings than a $5 packet of premium seeds from a garden center. Nobody in the seed industry wants you to see that sentence. 7 days after sprouting, the seedlings had grown their first true leaves, the real leaves that follow the initial rounded cotyledons. This is the stage where you thin. Multiple seedlings in one small cup will compete for light, water, and nutrients, and all of them will suffer. So I selected the healthiest, most vigorous seedling in each cup and carefully cut the rest at the soil line with a small pair of scissors. You cut rather than pull because pulling can disturb the roots of the seedling you are keeping. 8 days after thinning, the plants had put on real growth, strong stems, deep green color, healthy root systems visible through the translucent cup walls. It was time to move them into their permanent homes. For the plant grown from the whole tomato slice, I chose to plant directly into the ground. I raked back the wood chip mulch until I hit native soil, then dug a hole roughly twice the width of my solo cup using a hand trowel. At the bottom of the hole, I added just over half a tablespoon of all-purpose granular fertilizer and mixed it into the surrounding soil to prevent root burn. Then I popped the seedling out of the cup, placed it in the hole, and backfilled with native soil. When I was almost level with the original soil surface, I sprinkled in the remaining fertilizer, finished backfilling, and watered deeply. Then I pulled the wood chip mulch back around the base of the plant to insulate the soil, retain moisture, and suppress weeds. Because I suspected this was a determinate tomato variety, meaning it would grow to a fixed size, set one large round of fruit, and then stop producing, I placed a 54-inch galvanized tomato cage around it. Determinate tomatoes do not need the aggressive pruning and staking that indeterminate varieties require. A simple cage supports the branches as they load up with fruit. For the second plant, the one grown from 2 extracted seeds, I went with a container, a 5-gallon food-safe bucket from the hardware store with drainage holes drilled in the bottom. I filled it with homemade soil mix, added about 2 tablespoons of all-purpose fertilizer mixed into the top few inches, made a hole with my hand, and gently transplanted the seedling, watered the whole thing in thoroughly. Now here is where the real story begins, because what happened over the next several weeks was not just a successful experiment, it was a confrontation with everything the food industry assumes about you. 9 days after transplanting, the plant in the ground looked healthy, vibrant, and completely at home. Deep green foliage, strong stem development, already beginning to branch out. This plant had come from a cheeseburger, and it looked better than half the transplants you would buy at a nursery for $4 each. The plant in the container was even further along, already showing flower clusters forming in the center, which meant fruit was on the way. Flowers on a tomato plant are not decoration. They are the future. Every single tomato you have ever eaten started as a small yellow flower, and this plant, grown from a seed I pulled out of a fast food burger with my fingertip, was already producing them. Let me tell you what the food industry does not want you to think about right now. Americans spend over $270 billion per year on fruits and vegetables. Tomatoes alone represent a $6 billion annual market in the United States. The average American household spends roughly $850 per year on fresh produce. And the average price of tomatoes in a U.S. grocery store hovers around $3 to $4 per pound. A single healthy tomato plant produces 10 to 20 pounds of fruit over its growing season. Some determinate varieties produce their entire yield in a concentrated burst. That is $40 to $80 worth of tomatoes at grocery store prices from one plant, grown from a seed that came free inside a $3 burger. Now multiply that by 10 plants, by 20, by the 40 million American households with a backyard or a balcony large enough for a 5-gallon bucket. The math is simple, and the industry knows it. If even a fraction of American consumers started growing tomatoes from the seeds already present in the food they purchase, the fresh tomato market would contract by billions. But that is the small picture. The bigger picture is the seed industry itself. 4 corporations control over 60% of the global proprietary seed market. Bayer, which absorbed Monsanto. Corteva, spun off from Dow DuPont. Syngenta, owned by ChemChina, and BASF. These companies do not just sell seeds, they engineer dependency. The majority of commercial tomato varieties sold to farmers and available in grocery stores are F1 hybrids. An F1 hybrid is created by crossing 2 specific parent lines to produce offspring with desirable traits, uniform size, disease resistance, shelf stability, thick skin for shipping. But here is the engineering detail that changes everything. F1 hybrids do not grow true to seed. When you save seeds from a hybrid tomato and plant them, the offspring will not be identical to the parent. They will show variation. Some plants may be larger, some smaller. Some fruit may be a different shape. The characteristics split and recombine unpredictably, leaning toward one parent line or the other. This is not a flaw. This is a feature. The entire hybrid seed model is built on the assumption that you will buy new seeds every season because the ones you save will not produce the same result. It is planned genetic obsolescence, the agricultural equivalent of a phone that slows down after 2 years. And I saw this firsthand in my own experiment. The 2 McDonald's tomato plants, grown from seeds taken from the same type of burger, produced noticeably different fruit. The plant in the ground set a staggering amount of tomatoes, more fruit than I have ever seen on a single plant in my life. But the tomatoes were large and round. The plant in the container produced smaller, thinner tomatoes that looked more like grape or cherry tomatoes. Same seed source, same parent tomato, different expressions, because these were hybrid seeds, and hybrid seeds break apart in the next generation. The industry designed it this way, not so the tomato would fail, but so you would fail to replicate it, so you would try once, see inconsistent results, and conclude that saving seeds does not work. So you would go back to buying transplants at the garden center for $4 each, or tomatoes at the store for $4 per pound. So you would stay inside the system. They did not make seed saving illegal. They made it unreliable. And unreliable is just as effective as illegal when it comes to consumer behavior. But here's what they did not account for. The seeds still grow, the plants still produce, the tomatoes still taste good. In fact, in my experiment, the container tomatoes, the smaller ones, actually tasted sweeter than the ones from the ground plant. Different from the parent, yes. Inferior, absolutely not. Let me walk you through what happened as the season progressed, because the production from these plants was genuinely shocking. Within weeks of transplanting, both plants were flowering heavily. The ground plant in particular was setting fruit at a rate I had never seen before. But I also started seeing early blight on some of the lower leaves, a common fungal issue characterized by brown spots with concentric rings, like tiny bullseyes on the foliage. This is normal in humid climates. It does not mean the plant is dying. It means the lower leaves, closest to the soil, are being splashed with fungal spores during rain or watering. The fix is simple, and the industry will never teach it to you because they would rather sell you fungicide. You remove the affected leaves. That is it. I sprayed my pruners with isopropyl alcohol to sterilize them, then cut out every leaf showing blight symptoms. I only removed fan leaves, never growing tips, because this was a determinate variety, and removing the tops would eliminate future fruit production. This basic pruning kept the disease from spreading up the plant, and the new growth above stayed healthy and clean. For the container plant, I ran into a different problem, and this one was my fault. As the summer heat intensified, I was not consistent enough with watering. A tomato plant in a 5-gallon bucket on a hot day can transpire an astonishing amount of water. On the hottest days, it needs watering twice. I was not always there to do it. The soil dried out, then I would come back and drench it, and that cycle of drought and flood stressed the plant in 2 critical ways. First, it caused blossom drop. The flowers that would have become tomatoes simply fell off because the plant could not support them under water stress. Second, and more visibly, it caused blossom end rot on the fruit that did form. Blossom end rot is that dark, sunken, leathery patch on the bottom of a tomato. It is not a disease. It is a calcium transport issue caused by inconsistent moisture. The plant cannot move calcium to the developing fruit when water availability swings wildly. The fruit rots from the blossom end inward. This is important because blossom end rot is the #1 reason new gardeners give up on container tomatoes. They see the rotten spots, assume the plant is diseased, and throw the whole thing away. The gardening industry is happy to sell them a new transplant next season. But the fix is not a new plant. The fix is consistent watering. That is it. Water evenly and blossom and rot disappears. The ground plant, by contrast, had access to a much larger volume of soil with more consistent moisture retention, and it showed. By August 1st, the level of production was staggering. Clusters of tomatoes hanging from every branch, weighing the stems down so far they leaned against the cage. Some of the fruit was larger than others, another artifact of the hybrid genetics, but the sheer volume was unlike anything I had ever grown. More tomatoes on one plant than some gardeners get from an entire row. By August 27th, the first tomatoes were ripening, deep red blush spreading across the skin. I harvested the ripe ones that day and kept coming back as more turned. The plant had shifted all its energy from growing new foliage to ripening fruit. The leaves were starting to yellow and decline, which is completely normal for a determinate variety at the end of its cycle. It had done its job. It had set its fruit. Now it was finishing the work. The container plant ripened earlier, likely due to the stress it had been under. Stress often accelerates ripening in tomatoes, a survival response, the plant rushing to produce viable seeds before it dies. The fruit was smaller, but it was ready sooner. I harvested 4 nice-looking tomatoes from it, along with several that had blossom and rot damage. 108 days after planting 2 seeds from a McDonald's burger, I stood in my garden holding a full harvest of homegrown tomatoes. Let me tell you what that moment felt like, because it did not feel like gardening. It felt like waking up. I sliced into the first ripe tomato from the ground plant. The flesh was firm, the color was deep red throughout, and the juice ran clean. I took a bite. No acidity. Sweet, but a mild sweet. The kind of tomato you could eat like an apple, standing right there in the garden. Genuinely good flavor, not the mealy, pale, gas-ripened disappointment you get at the supermarket in January. Real food, grown from a fast food burger. The container tomatoes, the smaller ones, tasted even sweeter. More like a cherry tomato or a grape tomato than a paste variety. Different from its sibling plant. Different from the parent tomato, but delicious in its own right. 13 days after the first harvest, a windstorm battered the garden. The ground plant, already weakened from the end of its natural cycle, was struggling to ripen the enormous volume of fruit still hanging on its branches. I made a decision. I harvested everything, green and all, and brought it inside to ripen off the vine. I picked a fresh apple from my apple tree, placed it in a cardboard box, then surrounded it with the unripe tomatoes. The apple releases ethylene gas, a natural plant hormone that triggers ripening in nearby fruit. This is not a trick. This is the same biology that commercial tomato distributors use in their ripening warehouses, except they use synthetic ethylene gas pumped into sealed chambers and charge you $4 a pound for the result. I used an apple and a cardboard box. A few days later, the tomatoes had ripened beautifully, red, fragrant, and ready to eat. When I laid out the full harvest from both plants, the picture told the entire story. The ground plant had produced a massive yield of Roma-type tomatoes, more fruit by weight than I have ever harvested from a single plant. The container plant produced a smaller yield of thinner, sweeter tomatoes, limited by the watering stress but still perfectly edible. Together, they represented pounds of fresh produce grown from seeds that were destined for a landfill inside a fast food wrapper. Now here is the part I need to be honest with you about. These tomatoes were not identical to the ones McDonald's puts on their burgers. They were likely not identical to the original parent variety at all. Because hybrid seeds do not reproduce true to type, what I grew was a genetic roll of the dice. I got Roma-type fruit instead of the slicing tomato I expected. I got variation between 2 plants grown from the same source. And some of the characteristics, like the uneven ripening on the ground plant, may have been traits that the parent hybrid was specifically bred to suppress, but that resurfaced in the offspring generation. If you want an exact replica of a specific tomato variety, you need open-pollinated or heirloom seeds, varieties that have been stabilized over generations to reproduce true to type. Those exist, and they are worth growing. But they are not what you find in fast food or most grocery store produce because the industry deliberately chose hybrids that cannot be reliably reproduced. They chose dependency over self-sufficiency, every single time. But here is what matters. The tomatoes I grew were real. They were nutritious. They were delicious. They cost me $3 and some dirt. And the act of growing them taught me more about food, about seeds, about the system that feeds us, than 20 years of grocery shopping ever did. Your great-grandparents saved seeds from every tomato they ate, every pepper, every squash, every melon. They did not buy seeds in glossy packets from a corporate display rack. They saved them in envelopes, in jars, in folded newspaper, and they passed them down like heirlooms because that is literally what heirloom seeds are. Seeds that families preserved across generations because they were too valuable to throw away. Then the seed industry consolidated. 4 companies gained control of the majority of the world's commercial seed supply. Hybrid varieties replaced open pollinated lines. Seed patents made it illegal to save and replant certain commercial varieties. And an entire culture forgot that the food in their kitchen contained the means to grow more food. The average American household throws away approximately 30% of the food it purchases. That is not just wasted nutrition, it is wasted seeds, wasted potential, wasted self-sufficiency. Every tomato that goes into a trash can carried seeds that could have become 10 pounds of new tomatoes. Every pepper, every squash, every cucumber. The reproductive biology of the food you buy is sitting right there on your cutting board, and the entire supply chain is designed to make sure you never look at it that way.